This podcast is brought to you by Progressive. Are you driving your car or doing laundry right now? Podcasts go best when they're bundled with another activity, like Progressive home and auto policies. They're best when bundled too. Having these two policies together makes insurance easier and could help you save. Customers who save by switching their home and car insurance to Progressive save nearly $800 on average. Quote a home and car bundle today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $793 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2021 and May 2022. Potential savings will vary. This episode is brought to you by SAP. First, the bad news. SAP Business AI will not help you generate cubist versions of your family's holiday photos, but it will help you understand which supplier is best to help you roll out your plant-based packaging in Southeast Asia, or identify the training your junior project manager needs to rise up the ranks, or automate repetitive tasks while you focus on big innovations. So you can be ready for the next opportunity. Revolutionary technology, real-world results. That's SAP Business AI. If you had to use one word, how would you describe the state of the Middle East right now, militarily?
Chaotic?
Yeah. Josh Keating covers international affairs over at Vox. I called him up because I needed someone to talk me through the relentless headlines I've been reading about the ripple effect of the war on Gaza.
The other big story this morning, the U.S. launching a new attack against a militant group in the Middle East.
What we have are these, lots of little conflicts all over the place.
This morning, explosions in the city of Erbil, Iraq, after neighboring Iran launched ballistic missiles.
Related violent episodes in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in Iran, in Yemen, in the Red Sea.
The strike came just hours after the Pentagon said a Houthi drone attacked a U.S. cargo ship.
You just see sort of little aspects of it popping up all over the place.
All of this raising concern about a wider spillover of violence across the region stemming from the ongoing war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza.
Even if none of them are really full-scale war the way we're seeing in Gaza, there's definitely instability and violence in all these places, and they're all related.
Yeah, with some of these attacks, it's hard for me to even see how they connect back to Israel. It just seems like some kind of domino effect.
Yeah, for instance, Iran launched missiles at this separatist group in Pakistan a few days ago, which does not appear to be directly related to what's going on in Gaza. But, it sort of seems like while attention is elsewhere, they're sort of taking advantage of it to pursue other goals.
Josh says, to understand this ramp up in violence, you need to understand the choreographed dance many countries are doing right now. The primary players are Iran and Israel and the U.S. And then there are Iran's allies in Syria and Lebanon and Yemen. Yemen's Houthis have been fighting especially hard. They're punching above their weight, as Josh puts it. But even the Houthis fighting, it seems somewhat contained.
It's this strange dynamic where there's this sort of ongoing low-boil war in the Middle East, this sort of low-intensity conflict that happens within prescribed boundaries.
Is there a risk that the low boil kind of comes to a head, starts doing more than simmering?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the thing people are really concerned about right now. But I think if you look at the statements coming out of Tehran, they express solidarity with the Palestinian people, they condemn Israel, but they don't say they're going to war.
So if a wider war is unlikely, why does it feel like that wider war is already happening? Today on the show, how Iran and its axis of resistance are keeping the pressure on in the Middle East. I'm Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around. This episode is brought to you by SAP. First, the bad news. SAP Business AI will not help you generate cubist versions of your family's holiday photos, but it will help you understand which supplier is best to help you roll out your plant-based packaging in Southeast Asia, or identify the training your junior project manager needs to rise up the ranks, or automate repetitive tasks while you focus on big innovations. So you can be ready for the next opportunity. Revolutionary technology, real-world results. That's SAP Business AI. This episode is brought to you by Splunk. You need to keep operations humming around the clock, but potential disruptions are everywhere. Splunk helps you predict problems and find and fix issues fast, so you can reduce risk and ditch downtime. The world's largest enterprises rely on Splunk's unified security and observability platform to become more efficient, resilient, innovative. With Splunk, you can react quickly, evolve faster, and be ready for anything. Stay ahead of disruptions. Learn more at splunk.com/resilience. I want to go back to the beginning of this escalation we're seeing now to see if we can just talk about how it all began. After October 7th, what happened outside of Israel at that moment? Like, how did the conflict begin to make itself apparent in places outside of Israel and Gaza?
Well, I think it started on the northern border. I think you saw a sort of increase in exchanges of fire between Israel and Hezbollah, and you saw an increased tempo of attacks on U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria by Iran-linked militias. And then you saw the Houthis surprising everybody by firing a ballistic missile at the southern Israeli resort city of Eilat, which is something I think a lot of people didn't even realize they were capable of.
Yeah, I feel like we should contextualize and just talk about how far Yemen is away from Israel. Like, there's a reason why this is surprising. Like, it's not like they're next door neighbors.
No, they're not. Yemen sits more than 1,000 miles from Israel. We know they have missiles. They've attacked targets in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates before, but they've never fired anything this far. So I think they surprised a lot of people with both their military capabilities and with their global ambitions.
Can we just pause here and answer the question, who are the Houthis?
So the Houthis are a group. They're a member of a minority Shia Muslim sect in northern Yemen. And they first kind of came on the scene in the 1990s as a rebel group fighting against the government of the then dictator Ali Abdullah Saleh. Saleh was overthrown in Arab Spring-linked protests in 2012, which created this power vacuum in the country, which the Houthis took advantage of, and they seized the capital in 2014, and they still hold it today.
So they're like the de facto government in some areas, even though we call them a rebel group.
Right. They control about, I believe it's a third of Yemen's territory, but the most populous parts of the territory and the capital. But they're not recognized as the legitimate government of Yemen by the international community. The Houthis, since they seized the capital in 2014, have been fighting this brutal civil war against Yemen's internationally recognized government, as well as a military coalition led by Saudi Arabia, which received a lot of funding and backing from the United States as well.
They have a pretty intense slogan, right? Like, death to America, death to Israel, damnation to the Jews. Like, that's not subtle.
Yeah, God is great, death to America, death to Israel, curse on the Jews, and victory for Islam. So this being their slogan, it definitely indicates that they have international ambitions, that they're concerned with more than just control of Yemen. But I think despite that, people have tended to sort of think of them in the past as a more kind of localized threat, but not one that sort of plays the international role that they have been for the last few weeks.
Yeah, my favorite quote about them came from this Yemeni analyst who gave a speech about, like, who are the Houthis, and said, I think they dream that the Americans or Israelis attack them because then they'll become a real resistance force. And it just sort of, it helps you understand who they are and their goals.
Yeah, they've been telling their own fighters that they're fighting against the U.S. and Israel, to the point that, that there are some accounts where they interview some of these fighters who say like they were surprised that, when they went to war, they weren't fighting against Americans or Israelis. They're like, we were fighting against other Yemenis mostly.
Hmm. And they had been designated a terrorist organization, but then the U.S. downgraded them because aid needed to get into Yemen. Is that correct?
Yeah, so one thing that's been happening is that for the last 2 years, Yemen's been in a ceasefire. So while the sort of humanitarian situation's been extremely dire in that country still, there at least hasn't been fighting for the last couple of years. And the U.S. took the step of removing them from the designated terrorist list to allow sort of aid to continue to flow through into Yemeni-controlled areas of the country.
Because people in Yemen were starving. There were awful pictures of children and babies.
Yeah, and the UN has estimated that more than 377,000 people have been killed by this conflict, but the majority of those are not people who are actually killed by the fighting. Most of that's due to malnutrition, unsafe water, bad medical services. So this has been repeatedly described as the world's worst humanitarian crisis. It arguably still is. And so I think that was part of the reason why they were taken off the list, was to just permit more aid to flow into the country. The Biden administration now is saying they are redesignating them as on the terrorist list and reimposing a lot of these sanctions because of the attacks on global shipping that we've seen.
So what did the Houthi attacks look like over the last couple of months? My impression just from reading is things kind of settled into this routine. They started attacking ships on the Red Sea. So when did it first become clear that that was going to be what they were doing?
Yeah, so this pattern kind of began in November. Houthi rebels boarded and seized the ship called the Galaxy Leader, which is partially owned by an Israeli businessman. And still, a lot of the articles about this, you see the pictures from that raid, which the Houthis distributed themselves, of these sort of armed gunmen, descending from a helicopter onto the deck of this ship. And they took the ship back to the coast of Yemen, where it still sits and where the crew of that ship are still being essentially held hostage.
That sounds like a really intense and very organized approach, like having a helicopter, getting on board a ship. I mean, this isn't just some guys in a boat with machine guns.
No, and I think you have to recognize the propaganda ability from this. So, because instantly there were sort of videos and photos of this, broadcast throughout the world. So it was a major, not only demonstration of their military capabilities, but their propaganda operation as well. But that was a little more of an outlier. Mostly they've been sort of firing rockets or missiles or drones at ships in the Red Sea. And there've been sort of different methods. One that, I think took a lot of military analysts by surprise and raised a lot of eyebrows. They've been firing ballistic missiles at ships. So, a ballistic missile, as opposed to a cruise missile, it travels a lot higher and a lot faster and is a lot more difficult to intercept with a lot of the sort of traditional naval countermeasures. And until now, anti-ship ballistic missiles have been sort of theoretical. Like until the Houthis did it, no one had ever actually used one of these in combat. And it's the kind of thing, military strategists talk about in a war with China. People wondered, could the Chinese military really, sink U.S. aircraft carriers with ballistic missiles?
So this is sophisticated.
It is sophisticated. Nobody really knew if even the Chinese military had the capability to do this, much less a group like the Houthis, who just went ahead and did it.
You've written about how I think 12% of global trade flows through the Red Sea. So you can see why this approach from the Houthis would be incredibly problematic, not just for the United States or Israel, but for basically anyone who wants goods to come to them and that need to come to them over the ocean.
Right. A huge percent of global oil and natural gas has to pass through this very narrow passageway. And that gives the Houthis a tremendous amount of leverage, and they've taken full advantage of this geography.
How so? Like they're parked in front of these tiny little entrance and exit points, or what?
Right. So there's not really any way around it. I mean, the way around it is you travel all the way around the coast of Africa, which adds at least 10 days travel time. And, you think about the extra fuel costs, the extra costs you have to pay the crew. Since the 19th century, when the Suez Canal opened, this route, this Red Sea route, has facilitated a lot of east-west trade, particularly between Europe and the Middle East and East Asia. And now we see major shipping lines and major energy companies avoiding that route altogether. I mean, you see things like a Tesla plant in Germany had to sort of shut down operations for a week because they weren't getting the spare parts they needed from Asia.
So back in December, the U.S. announced they were forming this coalition to protect maritime interests in the Red Sea. They sent warships to the region. Did any of this do anything to make things safer or calm down the markets?
Well, I think one thing you can give the U.S. military and all these militaries involved credit for is they're pretty good at shooting down the Houthi missiles and rockets. They have a pretty high success rate at intercepting these. The problem is the amount of money insurance companies are charging these shipping companies. That's gone through the roof in the last few months. So eventually, it actually just becomes cost prohibitive to take this route as opposed to just shipping it around Africa. So that means big shippers like Maersk, the big Danish shipper, and Hapag-Lloyd, and big energy companies like BP and Shell, they're all avoiding the Red Sea right now.
Eventually, after multiple warnings from the White House, the Biden administration opted to use firepower. Over the last week, they have launched a handful of airstrikes, which the Department of Defense claims will deteriorate the Houthis' ability to block global shipping.
But it doesn't seem to be having the deterrent effect they're hoping for. And I think it's worth keeping in mind, the Houthis have been fighting a war against a, U.S. armed, Saudi-led coalition with overwhelming air superiority for a decade. So if that didn't stop them, then, a few sort of targeted U.S. missile strikes, it seems unlikely that's going to do it either.
After the break, the regional instability and violence continues to expand beyond the Red Sea.
This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Hey, listeners, whether you love true crime or comedies, celebrity interviews, news, or even motivational speakers, you call the shots on what's in your podcast queue, right? And guess what? Now you can call the shots on your auto insurance, too. Enter the Name Your Price tool from Progressive. The Name Your Price tool puts you in charge of your auto insurance by working just the way it sounds. You tell Progressive how much you want to pay for car insurance, then they'll show you a variety of coverages that fit within your budget, giving you options. Now that's something you'll want to press play on. It's easy to start a quote, and you'll be able to choose the best option for you, fast. It's just one of the many ways you can save with Progressive Insurance. Quote today at Progressive.com to try the Name Your Price tool for yourself and join the over 29 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law.
TIAA is on a mission. Why? Because 54% of Black Americans don't have enough savings to retire. So in collaboration with big-name artists like Wyclef Jean, TIAA released Paper Right. New music inspiring a new financial future. With 100% of streaming sales going to a nonprofit that teaches students how to invest. Stream Paper Right now and help close the gap.
Okay, so we've talked about the Houthi rebels and why it's so surprising that they've become main characters in the war in Gaza. Can we talk about some of the other Mideast players and escalations we've seen over the last few weeks? Because there have been a bunch of them and a bunch of smaller attacks. I sort of wonder if there's one attack or one genre of attack that particularly concerns you or got your attention.
It's interesting to watch what's been happening in Iraq, because you saw the U.S. launch a rare strike in Baghdad on the leader of one of these Iranian-backed militia groups. And you saw a few days ago, Iran actually launched an attack in Erbil, the capital of the Kurdish region, on what it said was a Mossad Israeli intelligence facility, but which also just appeared to be the compound of sort of a local businessman. And what struck me about that was it wasn't actually one of these proxy groups. It was Iran itself launching this missile. and sort of stepping out from behind the veil of these groups they usually act through. And so that felt like an escalation to me.
Yeah, it also forefronts Iraq as this place where the U.S. military has withdrawn significant amounts of forces, but there's still so much happening there. Different countries in the region are definitely still using Iraq as kind of a home base, a place to operate from, and a place where like local disagreements are being, you can see them take place in real time.
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. still has about 2,500 troops in Iraq and a few hundred in Syria as well. This is kind of the legacy of the war against ISIS. And that was sort of an interesting conflict because there you saw these Iran-backed militias that we're talking about now kind of fighting on the same side as the U.S. against the sort of common threat of ISIS. Now that ISIS is less of a factor, they're sort of turning on each other, and the Iran-backed groups are training their fire on the U.S. military in the region.
Yeah. And then over the last week, Iran and Pakistan started sparring. What happened there? Like, because, yeah.
Yeah, what is going on there? That was kind of a reminder that, there are conflicts happening nearby and conflicts that involve Iran that actually sort of have very little to do with Israel or the United States. And you saw that this week with Iran firing a missile strike at this group in Pakistan, a separatist group that is sort of fighting for, an independent state in both Pakistan and Iran. And so, there are multiple things and there are connections between them, but the connections are sometimes a little tenuous. And so, we talked earlier about Israel being drawn into a two-front war. I mean, Iran is fighting enemies on multiple fronts as well.
It's funny because Pakistan returned, volleyed back when they were attacked by Iran. But then at the same time, they had these carefully crafted statements that they issued, basically saying like, okay, like now that we've gotten that out of our system, I think we can all say we're brotherly countries and dialogue and cooperation is important. And it was just so interesting to me as a representation of what this moment is, which is people skirmishing with each other, but then also very much wanting to keep the skirmishing under control.
We do have, in the past few years, examples of sort of major raging conflicts in the Middle East with huge numbers of casualties. The war in Yemen, the war in Syria, what we're seeing in Gaza right now. But, on the edge of those, what we see are this sort of dance of escalation and de-escalation where you see proxies firing at each other. You see sort of limited strikes, using missiles and drones. And so there's this kind of like low intensity conflict happening all around, which often doesn't lead to sort of all out conflict the way we've been seeing in these other places.
We're talking about this low intensity conflict, but it is still hotter conflict than we had, 6 months ago. And I do wonder what it would take to roll back what we've seen over the last few weeks and months. Like, is there a strategy for that you're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, there was the now infamous Foreign Affairs article that Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, published right around the time of the October 7th attacks, which described the Middle East as being, quieter than it's ever been in years. And I'm sure Sullivan regrets writing that, but, at the time it was true. I mean, there had been, you saw Saudi Arabia and Iran talking to each other. You saw, sort of normalization happening between a lot of countries in Syria. I think that the problem was like during that period, a lot of people were just kind of sidelining the Israeli-Palestinian issue and assuming it would go away. And I think a lot of Arab governments hope for that as well. Like as much as the Palestinian cause is like a live wire in Middle Eastern politics, I think a lot of their governments would prefer to just move on from that. But, I think in a really gruesome, horrible way, the October 7th attacks were a way of putting the Israeli-Palestinian conflict very much back on everybody's global agenda. There's no way to ignore it after that.
So all roads to de-escalation run through Israel and Gaza.
I think as long as the war in Gaza is raging, as long as the level of casualties are as high as they are right now, and as long as there doesn't really seem to be a way out of it, it's hard to see how any of these other situations resolve themselves.
Josh Keating, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Josh Keating is a senior correspondent at Vox, covering foreign policy and world news, with a focus on the future of international conflict. And that's the show. If you're a fan of what we're doing here at What Next, the best way to support us is to join Slate Plus. That's our membership program. Go on over to slate.com/whatnextplus and sign up. What Next is produced by Paige Osborne, Elena Schwartz, Rob Gunther, Anna Phillips, and Madeline Ducharme. We are led by Alicia Montgomery with a little boost from Susan Matthews. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations here at Slate. And I'm Mary Harris. Thanks for listening. Catch you back here next time.
Advice Week is back at Slate, and we have a ton of exclusive content and exciting perks for Slate members. Subscribe now to unlock extra advice with weekly bonus segments of Dear Prudence. Plus, you'll get ad-free listening across all your favorite Slate podcasts. By joining, you're supporting Slate's independent journalism. Your membership matters. To subscribe now at our special Advice Week price, click Try Free at the top of your show page on Apple Podcasts, or visit slate.com/podcast plus.